Regarding Men, Episode 10, The Malevolent Violence Against Women Act.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Paul Elam with a voice for men and an ear for men. And per usual, I am joined for this episode of Regarding Men. I think this is episode, what?
10.
What episode is it? 10.
Are we 10?
Yes. Oh my goodness, big 10.
10th anniversary.
And I'm joined by Tom Golden of MenAreGood.com and Janice Fiamengo of Studio Brule and another worldwide voice in men's issues. And today we're going to be talking about VAWA, or the Violence Against Women Act, which of course, who could vote against that? Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994, signed into law by President Bill Clinton. It was authored by Joe Biden. That's creepy Joe Biden to some of you. And another Democrat senator whose name I cannot recall. But it has been reauthorized since.
Slaughter. Wasn't it?
Right.
Last name Slaughter? I forget her first name. I wrote it down somewhere.
That's appropriate.
Can't find it, but definitely Slaughter.
Yeah.
Slaughter's all you need to know.
That's enough.
That's a good name for the author of this unmitigated barrel of stinking feminist pork that has been good for draining the federal coffers for $1 billion plus a year since its inception. Much of the money has been squandered. They don't know where it went. There's been all kinds of controversy about that, but spineless politicians of both parties in Washington will not investigate it. But the squandered money is absolutely not the worst of this situation. VAWA has forced all kinds of changes that go to police training funding, to things like primary aggressor laws, to mandatory arrest policies. It is not just a way for feminists to gather funding, although it's been like one of their primary sources of funding for a long time. But it's also a way to spread hate and bigotry against men.
And
they've
lies.
been doing it full force ever since 1994. Now, in looking at the recent information on VAWA, I have not been able to tell if it's currently authorized. I know that the authorization lapsed in February, that they passed a temporary measure to continue funding it, but as far as I got in the reading, the temporary measure has now expired. But I guess the politicians are, finding a way around that to continue the funding anyway. I don't think this means that VAWA is in danger. I think eventually they will refund it. They'll reauthorize it, because that's what gutless politicians do when it comes to something like, how on earth could anybody vote against, combating violence against women? Never mind that women are half of the domestic violence picture in our culture. Never mind that the money is going out the window at an alarming rate. Never mind that men are being mislabeled. And the true causes of domestic violence, mental health issues, poverty, lack of education, multi-generational family dysfunction, all these things which are the actual driving factors for violence of any kind in relationships, is being totally ignored in favor of the gendered model. There's a lot to discuss here. There is so much wrong with this bill,
Yes.
with this law, that, we could take hours and hours and we'd never be able to cover all of it. But that's an introduction to what we're talking about. Now I'll throw it out to one of my two compadres here for somebody to pick up the mantle and run with it.
Well, I'll tell you, the thing that I think we need to start with is that the whole thing was based on lies. The whole thing was literally based on lies. And we know that because Ellen Pence, the author of, I forget what book was, but she was involved in the Duluth model and the creation of the Duluth model, etc. One of her books, here's a quote. Listen to what she says. "In many ways, we turned a blind eye to many women's use of violence, their drug use and alcoholism, and their often harsh and violent treatment of their own children." So she's saying that in the early days, they turned a blind eye to women's violence, but focused on the men's violence. And so they did that. They started getting this, at least $500 million a year. And what did they do? They started training. They trained the daggone legal system. They trained the judicial system. They trained the media. They trained Hollywood. They trained the legislators, the judges. Everybody got this, quote, training that was based on lies. And they've literally, in 50 years, I mean, when you think about it, it's a pretty amazing thing they've done. They have basically embedded lies into our cultural narrative that now are seen as truth. And it's just amazing. I mean, the whole thing is based on the idea that women are the victims of domestic violence and men are the bad guys. It's like people believe that. You ask the man on the street, what about domestic violence? Oh, poor women, these men, blah, blah, blah. Men are causing it. Men have to stop this. It's like, this is crazy. And they've done it with this funding. I mean, imagine if we had $1 million for the three of us to do for a year to work on things. I mean, wow. And imagine 800 times that. Wow. That's what they've had just in VAWA. And that's just one piece of their funding. Anyway, don't let me get started. Janice, what do you got to say?
Yeah, well, it's very disturbing. It's the Duluth model, of course, that governs all of the thinking around domestic violence. And, if you put into Google, if you ask the question, does VAWA discriminate against male victims? What you find is a whole bunch of websites, some government authorized, stating very strongly that the language of VAWA, even though it's called the Violence Against Women Act, that the language of VAWA is consciously gender neutral. VAWA,
bullshit.
It's unbelievable. I have one thing here. It's called the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence Against Women. Frequently asked questions about VAWA and gender. The first question, why is the bill called the Violence Against Women Act? And it makes the point that good old Joe Biden himself said, the bottom line is violence, no matter what gender the victim. Because of that, the Violence Against Women Act applies to all victims of domestic violence, irrespective of their gender. Nothing in the act denies services, programs, funding, or assistance to male victims of violence. So anybody out there who's doing basic research on whether VAWA includes male victims will be told unequivocally that yes, it serves men, it offers its services. That's the very next question. Does the Violence Against Women Act currently serve men? The answer is yes. The services are available to victims regardless of gender. So, it's outright lies. It then, of course, goes on in the very same document to say that the, overwhelming, preponderance of victims are female. It quotes something like 86% of victims of domestic violence, and it explicitly counters other surveys such as the Center for Disease Control that is often cited that found that it's basically gender parity in those who report victimization. It actually explicitly counters that and says that those statistics have been misused because they count women who are defending themselves against violence. They count them as aggressors, and so they aggressively counter all of the reams of research that is out there showing gender parity. In fact, showing that more men than women are reporting their victimization in domestic violence. So yet claiming at the same time that all of their services are offered in a gender neutral way. I mean, it's just astonishing.
Crazy. And
let's take a look at what happens too. I mean, I've seen this illustrated, this so-called gender neutral stance of VAWA, and I've seen the results of it as it applies in clinical settings. And it's a disgraceful picture Back in the 90s, when I worked in those settings, in chemical dependency programs, we had a pattern set up and established that we would evaluate every woman who came in the door for whether or not she had been physically abused in her relationship, and every man for whether or not he'd perpetrated physical abuse.
Correct.
And despite this so-called gender neutrality, when I finally woke up to what was going on with this and started asking more of my male clients about their problems in that area, the first male client that I asked if he had ever suffered any physical abuse in his marriage, he said, yeah, one night I went to sleep and she hit me over the head with a fireplace poker. Ooh. And I got 12 stitches in the top of my head. And I took this to my staff, and these are all people that were, totally indoctrinated in the VAWA view and the Duluth model, and said, look at this. We need to take a look at this. This is something wrong. Because then when I called around to the different shelters in town trying to find services for this guy, they laughed at me.
Yeah.
They thought I was joking.
Yeah.
And one of them even offered, well, we've got anger management,
right,
that we can put him in and treat him like a perpetrator. This is what Janice just read, the so-called gender neutral language of the act. This is how that gender neutral language gets expressed in clinical treatment settings, and it's still that way.
It is.
It hasn't changed a bit in all these years.
I was just talking to a man a couple of days ago who found himself homeless as a result of his wife's violence against him, and he phoned around to all sorts of shelters, and he couldn't find anyone that offered services for men. Right. Certainly that's the same in Canada. I'm sure that there is still not a single shelter that offers services for male victims of domestic violence.
We have 2 in the United States out of 2,000 shelters for women. There's one in Arkansas and one in Texas, interestingly enough. But that's it. I mean, other than that, there's nothing else available. And these are recent additions, and probably after some pressure about the fact that these programs are not gender neutral at all. They exclude men intentionally. And it all goes back to this crazy Duluth model, which you can say you're gender neutral all you want to, but if you're based on the Duluth model, that's based on the idea of patriarchy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, even if we went by their own figures, if we accepted that 85% of cases involve a male abuser and an innocent woman victim, the Duluth model still then wouldn't explain the 15% for male victims of female perpetrators, because the entirety of the model is based on the idea that men have an entitlement to women's bodies, that power is not an expression of a man's, having himself been abused or having, as you said, Paul, substance abuse problems or mental health problems. It's an expression of his patriarchal privilege. Well, then how does that explain the 15% of women who are abusive? It doesn't, obviously, and they don't care about that. And of course, one of the other problems with VAWA, as I understand it, and I think I'm pretty sure this is happening in Canada as well, is that the definition of what constitutes violence it has been progressively expanded with the various modifications of the bill, so that now it can include pretty well any interaction between a woman and a man. If the man raises his voice, if the woman feels that he is in some way being controlling, that's of course completely out of the Duluth model. If she feels that her financial needs have not been met by her partner, if she merely has a feeling of discomfort, that's enough for her, especially in a case of divorce, to be able to go to a judge and say that she's a victim of domestic violence, in which case then all sorts of services funded by VAWA cut in. And the thing about VAWA that's so brilliant, really, is that it has enabled police services, women's shelters, women's legal assistance, so many different services to operate in tandem so that a woman can get a restraining order against her partner. He can be thrown out of the house with basically nothing. He's then cut off from talking to his partner or seeing his children. He immediately has to start paying child support, even though his life is in tatters. If he doesn't pay child support, he's in even more serious trouble. He never has a chance to defend himself against the charge. It used to be he was able to cross-examine, the woman who was making the claims about him. Now she can do it in private with the judge. It's a very rare case for a judge not to authorize the restraining order, because of course, who wants to be a judge who didn't, give the restraining order and then something happens? And so, this massive system set up that denies men equal rights under the law, that denies them due process, and and totally destroys men's lives. So when I keep hearing about all these things about Joe Biden sniffing women's hair, and this is something I know we wanted to talk about, was the fact that the irony of Joe Biden being the author of this bill. That's not the issue. I don't care if he sniffs women's hair. I really don't. I don't care if he puts his hands on a woman's shoulders. If a woman isn't comfortable with that, surely she can tell him that.
Janice, are you a hair sniffing apologist?
I sure am. Anybody who wants to sniff my hair, if I don't like it, I'll tell you I'm not comfortable with it. I won't feel violated. My brain won't slow down and be unable the horror of it. The reality is that this man, whatever his personal peccadillos about hair or about children, I don't know. To me, I haven't, looked into it. A lot of the stuff that I've seen looks relatively innocent to me, but, I could be wrong. But the issue is that he is the author of this bill that has destroyed so many fathers' lives, and that will continue to, as long as we continue to say that anybody who questions this bill, or that, questions how these various services are offered and how they understand domestic violence, is somehow a woman hater. It's just our priorities are so messed up, and I tweeted something about Biden the other day, making fun of this Ms. Flores's claims about her hair, and I was jumped on by all these mostly anti-feminist followers of mine saying, no, Joe Biden is a very bad man. Joe Biden he's creepy Joe. He's made a lot of people feel uncomfortable. Who cares? That's the least of our problems with Joe Biden.
Right.
Hey, and the guy still has due process coming to him. He's been accused. I find, honestly, the timing of the accusation, just before he's going to announce. Now, come on. This is just more Me Too bullshit. But that said, I've seen a public record of just his behavior seeming to indicate the man has issues with boundaries, and I understand completely why. By his own admission, Joe Biden was raised in a family where his sister was allowed to beat the crap out of him. He said, quote, I'm quoting here, "I have the bruises to prove it." And the rule in his family was that if he lifted a finger to defend himself, the parents would go nuclear on him. Yep. The rule was, you will take the abuse from the girl in the family, and you will suffer through it, and you will keep your mouth shut, and you will not defend yourself. Now, let's take a look at the family pathology that's in that and wonder, is it any real coincidence that he comes up with legislation that defends abusive women and puts all the blame on men? This is like, people repeat family pathology. That's what we tend to do as human beings. And I think that's exactly what he's done with this Violence Against Women Act that he authored.
Gotta agree.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah.
Oh boy.
The other thing I wanted to add on to that too, in addition to what Janice was saying about all the destroyed lives and the corrupting of laws around VAWA, is that VAWA has also provided a fast track to con the immigration system for women who claim to be physically abused by their husband. It fast tracks them into green cards and the path to citizenship. And all they have to do is say, my husband back in Guatemala beat me. And of course, he's not there. We don't even know if she has a husband. But just that claim will get you help. And for those of you who think that just voting Republican is a solution to any of this, full disclosure, I'm voting Republican, but I don't do that with the expectation that conservative men in Congress are going to do anything but rubber stamp this bullshit legislation.
Yeah.
They will, and they have. If you look at their voting records, they will run over each other to get to reauthorize VAWA.
Yep.
It's a pretty sad situation.
It's white knight, baby. Get in there and do good for women and get reelected.
Bad situation.
You know, one of the things that I found really interesting and important for people to know is that there has been research on what happens to men when they are victims of domestic violence and they go to shelters.
Denise Hines?
I think it's Denise Hines did this research, and it is absolutely fascinating. And I wish every legislator would know about it because it's so critical. You know, because what it says is if you're a man and you go to a domestic violence center for help, they will probably turn you away telling you that you're the batterer. I mean, it's just that simple. I think it was, what, 70%, Paul, something like that?
Yes, it was.
And
right.
I think 90% of the men said, this place is horrible. It didn't really help me at all. You know, and that's what we're dealing with. You know, an anti-male, a hate male kind of organization that will not allow any kind of feedback. You know, feedback is seen as you know, an affront. Oh, you must be a misogynist. You know, everything is just completely turned around.
A certain percentage of them in the research were mocked and ridiculed when they sought help. Now imagine that. Imagine one, for the average guy, given the way that men are socialized, what it takes to get on the phone and call somebody and saying, I'm being abused by a woman. That's hard enough for men to do. It's really difficult.
Yes.
And then on the other end, they'll get a woman laughing at them.
Yes. Or telling them literally, we only help women. That's what happened to me when I was a therapist in I think it was the 90s, the early 90s. Somebody came to me and said, you know, we've got this person who's a domestic violence victim and blah, blah, blah. Can you help? I was like, I don't know. I don't know a thing about it. So I called the services and checked with them. And they said, oh, we can do this, 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 and this. Wonderful. And bring them to here and do this. And then they found out it was a man. And they completely shut down. So I thought, oh, man, that couldn't be. So I called the director of the center the next day. And I said the same thing. I said, you know, you do work with men, right? No, we don't work with men. I thought, holy crap. And so then I went a step of the legislator in the Maryland, and same thing. Then I went to the congressman and the senators, U.S. senators, all of them, same thing. You know, this whole system has been built. It's like a brick shithouse of lies that you can't penetrate. And men are the victims of this mess.
And their children. Keep in mind also
and their children
and I saw this many times over. You have a guy who's being physically battered. Often the wife is physically battering the children as well.
Yes.
And his choice is to either leave the children in the sole care of their abuser or to take them and probably face jail for taking them out of the home.
Right.
Because they'll call it a kidnapping.
Yep.
This is what's happening. Because, I mean, the supposedly helping women, a lot of these children are girls. It's not helping them. It's hurting them. It's actually destroying their lives.
Yes. It's a mess.
Yeah. For children to have an abusive mother who is not only not stopped, but actually affirmed and supported by everything in society, by all the state actors. That's a terrible, terrible thing for children to see. And I mean, the whole Duluth idea that men are entitled and so powerful, it really does. I mean, I worked at a women's shelter and a rape crisis hotline for a couple years, the early 90s. And you know, before we could even work there as volunteers, we had to go through extensive ideological training, also some practical, but it was really primarily ideological training. And I didn't know, or at least I don't remember that it was called the Duluth model, but it was exactly that. Yeah. That the only framework that we were given for understanding domestic violence and sexual violence was male entitlement. There was never any other kind of discussion. And so we were just marinated in that ideology that this is what men do because they want to do it. They get pleasure out of doing it. They believe they can do it. They believe it's their right and all that sort of thing. And then once I was actually on the phone line, I did actually get a call from a man. In this case, it was a male rape victim.
Huh.
And, I didn't know what I was supposed to say to him because I knew we don't offer any services for men. So I listened to him and talked to him and empathized with him. That was about all I could do. And when I got off the phone, there's always two people working. And the sort of my person in the supervisory capacity said, was that a man? That you could sort of tell because I was using gender neutral terms when I was talking to him. And her attitude, now I wouldn't say she was mocking, but her attitude was fairly explicitly, this is a men's problem. Right. So let the men help the men, was what she said. And she didn't feel that the organization, which was, publicly funded and largely supported by men, but she didn't feel that organization had any responsibility to serve male victims as well. She felt that as women, they were helping women and let the men help the men. Of course, as we know, as Erin Pitsey discovered when she tried to raise money for male victims of sexual violence and domestic violence, there is no interest or very little interest from other men in actually giving money to support men. So, it's a perfect conundrum.
Yes. God bless Erin Pitsey.
Yeah, speaking of Erin, I think we should point out that going back all the way, she was the pioneer that triggered the inception of the shelter movement back in 1971 in Cheswick, England. And she studied victims of domestic violence and the women coming out of abusive homes. And she found that as often as not, the women who were fleeing abusive homes were every bit as violent as the partners they were fleeing from, often violent with their children. And when she began talking about this, and she understood that domestic violence is not about patriarchy or male power or male privilege, it's about multi-generational dysfunction in families. It's passed down, one abusive parent to child to another. It's a learned behavior. She figured all that out. And when she stood up and talked about that, much less tried to raise money, but when she even began releasing the results of her investigations, the feminist community turned on her. Not turned on her by disagreeing with her. Turned on her with bomb threats and death threats. This is the same thing that, Murray Straus, which did a lot of work on this, and Marty Fiebert, all these guys, there's some people that have done some good research on this. They get bomb threats and death threats.
Yep.
Suzanne Steinmetz was another one.
Right.
Did a lot of research on this, and they threatened to kill her for doing it. The thing is that if you acknowledge that domestic violence is a multi-generational learned behavior, if you accept that, then it destroys the Duluth model completely. Even one female abuser destroys the Duluth model, much less the 50% of them that we know exist. It totally wipes out their justification for funding. Everything that they're standing on falls to pieces. So they desperately must keep the narrative contained to their worldview.
Correct.
Or their raison d'etre evaporates.
Yes.
And that's what we're seeing with this. And it's at the expense of a lot of terribly suffering people.
Yeah.
And it promoting, because when you won't intervene on violent women, their children learn to be violent and they grow up and the cycle starts all over again.
Yes, indeed. Exactly right.
Thank you, VAWA.
It's a crazy mess. It's a crazy mess, but thank God for truth tellers like Erin Pitsey and Straus and Fiebert and people like that. They really stood out there and told the truth, and they knew they were going to pay a price for it.
And we'll have a link below to Martin Fiebert's research. That
absolutely.
Really,
and the Denise Hines stuff, we'll have to link to that too. But one of the things that's fascinated me has been the people who do research on domestic violence, who do it from a feminist point of view. It's always fascinating me how they could rationalize only looking at female victims. So this is one, I did a video on this a while back. There was this one researcher, I came upon his study, and it was all about, 1 in 2 women will, be this and that and the other and whatever. And so I wrote to him, I said, well, why didn't you study men? And he didn't say anything. And then I wrote again. And finally, we got a conversation going. And he started explaining to me why he never thought about studying men. Let me give you a quote. It's fascinating. As I'd like physicians to think about asking men about interpersonal violence, a place to start is from the traditional heterosexual model of women as victims and men as perpetrators. Eventually, physicians may get to a point of asking women about perpetration and men about victimization. The medical community is not there yet and may not be there for many years.
So we're going to address the problem of ignoring men by ignoring men.
Yes, exactly. He goes, there's a couple of other, we corresponded for quite a while, but that's the gist of it right there. It's like, we're not there yet. So we'll study just the women. Let's think about it. We're going to have a Diabetes Act for white people, Diabetes Act for white people. Yes. Wonderful. Who would put up with that shit?
No.
Seriously, who would put up with that crap? That's crazy. But you can have a Violence Against Women Act and everyone thinks it's the wonderful thing from heaven. Ay, ay, ay.
Yeah.
Crazy, crazy.
Also provided below will be a link to a paper by Murray Straus. Bless the guy, he's passed away since then. But
was that right?
Yes, I heard that. Well, I don't want to say I hope it's true, but I think you know what I mean. I heard that he had passed away.
Yes.
But he gave AVFM permission to print his paper, to publish his paper on how research is corrupted by feminist scholars.
Absolutely.
And how they try to destroy anybody that does not come up with research results that are in line with the feminist narrative.
Yes.
And all the ways on it. And it's a devastating paper he wrote.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think thanks to gynocentrism and feminism's stranglehold on the academic community, not a thing has changed.
Yeah, people are afraid.
Still, you better not come up with results.
People are afraid.
Or you will be destroyed.
They're afraid. And it's a crazy place. You can't change it because people are so daggone afraid. It's absolutely nutty.
It is indeed.
We'll have to link to, I wrote a report for the Maryland Commission for Men's Health on male victims of domestic violence. This was a while back. It's still a pretty good read on how did they get to this point? How did they get to the point where they're thinking only women should be attended to? And it's kind of an interesting paper on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I bet it is.
Yeah, it's a good one.
But it is, this seems to be an intractable problem. I don't know if we can really ever root out the problem. I think the best thing we can do is to do what we're doing is for us to reach out to as many men as possible.
Yeah.
One, to encourage them to leave abusive partners at the earliest signs of abuse. Because understand, guys, your chances of getting help, of finding even clinical practitioners who give a damn, you will get therapists that will ask you what you did to provoke her.
Right.
Which would be absolutely verboten in dealing with women.
Yeah, you'll get zero help. Zero. So get your good red pill friends to help you out if you can,
It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. And at least that does seem to fall in line with the way most men will tend to address problems.
Yes.
And that is to take it head on and to do something for themselves. But it's still a shame, particularly for those men that are trapped with kids in an abusive relationship.
Yes.
And everybody, including the police.
Yeah.
What was it? One of the guys in the Red Pill movie said, I think it was Fred Hayward said, you better hope that if she attacks you, she doesn't break a nail. Because if she does, we're going to arrest you.
Yeah, and we didn't even talk about third-party abuse, which I think is so critical these days. And
proxy violence.
That's basically, that the woman beats up the guy, they go for help, and then the system, which is already biased terribly, as we've talked about so far, starts battering the man and takes the place of the woman. So that now it's the system that's doing the battering, the abuse, rather than the abuser. The abuser is seen as, oh, poor victim. We'll take care of her. This bad guy.
Or she goes to a family member or her boyfriend and says, my husband was really mean to me.
Yep.
And then the guy ends up being a victim of violence that way.
Yeah. Gynocentrism, baby. They use it for all it's worth. They squeeze it. They squeeze out every gynocentric molecule in their friends and men's bodies that then will take care of them and vilify the man. It's tough,
and
guys.
Keep in mind, for those of you, and I know we're going to get them in the comments saying, you can't trust women, blah, blah, blah. This proxy violence, this third-party violence, it's men. When you go to courts, 9 times out of 10, you're facing a man who's slamming down a gavel, ready to throw you in jail because you got in the way of her fists.
They've been trained.
Yes, they have been trained.
Oh,
this is not a us versus women thing. It's really not.
It's a setup, guys.
Gynocentrism systemically, hurting everybody.
Yeah.
Well, have we reached our end of discussion?
I think for today, but
we always end on a happy note, don't we?
Yeah. Speaking of happy notes, who do you think gets the humanitarian award today?
Janice, would you like to inform me?
Well, I think we should give it to Erin Pitsey. We agreed that we should give it to Erin Pitsey. Erin has been a voice for truth about the reality of domestic violence. As you said, Paul, that this is a learned behavior. This has to do with intergenerational violence, and it needs to be treated that way. And I am so thankful for her, her courage, incredible courage in speaking out about this truth. Only more people would listen.
She was truthful before being truthful was cool.
There you go.
Yeah, and is so incredibly astute to be able to see what was there, what nobody else could see, and what everybody else refused to see. She's such a marvelous woman.
I'll second that.
Absolutely.
How astute to
so it's a unanimous vote for Erin Pitsey.
Mm-hmm.
Go, Erin.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Joe Biden is getting our flying puta.
Joe gets the puta.
Yes. Joe has called anyone who objects to VAWA as a Neanderthal. He talked about the Neanderthal element in the Republican Party, those who back in, I think, 2013, when the fight about reauthorization was going on. The contempt, the outright lying about anyone who questions the uses to which the billions of dollars are being put is pretty unforgivable.
It is.
I definitely second the vote for Joe Biden to get it. I also would like to suggest that Joe get some therapy for his family abuse issues.
Yeah.
And that way he can quit acting out his trauma on the rest of the fucking world.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll give him the flying sniffing puta.
Yes, the flying hair sniffing puta.
Oh, God. Enough is enough. Poor Joe.
No sympathy.
Well, I agree. He needs some help. But man, what a he started.
Thank you all, and we will be back next week doing what we do.
Very good.
Bye.
You all take care. We'll see you then. Bye-bye. See if I can turn this thing off, Paul.
Why don't you turn it off?
Don't leave.